Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents An Army Afire, How the U.S. Army Confronted Its Racial Crisis in the Vietnam Era, by Beth Bailey. Narrated by Terrence Kidd. A note on language. In the 1960s and 1970s, the era about which I am writing, the ugliest of racial epithets were commonplace. As a historian, I believe it is important not to sanitize the past. Therefore, when the people about whom I write use such language, including the N-word, I quote exactly what they said. In a different vein, the U.S. Army used the term Negro in official documents through the end of the 1960s. This had been the term that civil rights organizations and most African Americans preferred. Its use at this time was respectful. By the mid to late 1960s, however, many young African Americans rejected that word. They wished to be called black, even as older officers and non-commissioned officers were often uncomfortable with the political connotations of that label. Army officers responded to this ongoing debate inconsistently. In my writing, I use our contemporary terms, black and African American. When I quote, I use the original language. In accordance with UNC Press style, I primarily use traditional rank abbreviations rather than U.S. Army-specific abbreviations in the text. Introduction. You show me a commander or leader who says he doesn't have race trouble, and I'll show you a dumb son of a bitch. Brigadier General George S. Patton, 1971. The U.S. Army was afire. Sparks had fallen in dry tinder, fanned by broader discord. A nation riven by racial violence, mired in the death throes of legal segregation, at odds over a failing war. Flames had ignited in soldiers' barracks and bars, found fuel in the Army's own policies and practices, caught fire in thousands of confrontations, large and small. Some burned brief, others flared out of control. By the cusp of the 1970s, race was tearing the Army apart. That wasn't supposed to be the story. Many Americans, black and white, civilian and in uniform, had seen the U.S. military as a model of racial progress. Flawed, sure, but nonetheless a counterbalance both to white segregationist mobs and to the clashes in the streets of American cities. That belief, like smoke, obscured the fire. It was not immediately obvious what threat the initial outbreaks posed, or even that they were part of a larger pattern. Not until the late 1960s did Army leaders begin to directly and systematically confront the expanding racial conflict. By the beginning of the 1970s, Army leaders had begun calling the crisis they confronted the problem of race. In Fort Hood, Texas, August 1968, 43 black soldiers refused orders to stand by for riot duty at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The people we are supposed to control, the rioters, are probably our own race, said one. We shouldn't have to go out there and do wrong to our own people. Some 9,000 miles away, in war-ravaged Vietnam, 200 black prisoners seized control of the Army jail at Long Binh. They burned buildings to smoldering embers, beat guards and fellow prisoners, repurposed Army blankets into makeshift dashikis, and improvised African drums. Their occupation lasted 3 weeks. That same year, in Neilingen, West Germany, 2 white soldiers stabbed 3 black soldiers to death. At Fort McClellan, Alabama, someone called the commander's office to warn that black soldiers, meeting off-post, were heading back to burn it down. Said a second anonymous caller to the staff duty officer, when the riot starts, tell Colonel Hip we are going to turn the weapons on him. Black power, baby. Ho Chi Minh. In 1970 at Fort Carson, Colorado, a white soldier, working part-time as a filling station attendant, murdered the head of the local university's Black Studies program. Next came a confrontation between 35 military police officers and 150 black soldiers, armed with handguns and a stash of M1 carbines. Dong Tam Base Camp in Vietnam's Mekong Delta struggled with roving gangs of black soldiers who attacked white soldiers at random. and at fire support base Buttons, close to the Cambodian border, a few dozen black soldiers debated how to force Whitey to pay attention to the blacks without injuring anyone. They destroyed 2 helicopters. The following year, in Pyeongtaek, South Korea, adjacent to Camp Humphreys, 100 black soldiers attacked a local bar that had replaced soul music with country and western, shifting its focus from black soldiers to white. At the 1st Cavalry Division's camp in the Central Highlands, Republic of Vietnam, a first sergeant ordered a black soldier into the field with his platoon. His response, "You stop fucking with us, Rabbit. We are not niggers. Niggers are scared. We are black men, and it don't matter." That afternoon, confronted by the troop commander, the soldier fired an automatic burst from his M16 at close range into the commander's head. "Don't cover the rabbit up," he shouted when a staff sergeant tried to spread a poncho over the body. "All you rabbits take a good look. That's what we are going to do to all you rabbits." By 1972 in West Germany, officers and NCOs, black and white, had begun refusing to enter barracks unless they were armed. In Stuttgart, a group of black soldiers attacked a police station using knives and broken bottles. The fight lasted for 5 hours. Time magazine called it the war within the war, and the Army's problem of race did seem more urgent in the context of the controversial and failing war in Vietnam. Within the war, however, among men in combat, race was usually set aside. It was at the periphery of war where conflict flourished. Conflict was most likely when soldiers had too little to do, were bored and frustrated, left with little sense for why their presence mattered. Nonetheless, racial conflict extended from fire bases in Vietnam to army posts within the United States and to installations in West Germany, Korea, Thailand, and Okinawa. It spilled into the streets of surrounding communities, both within the United States and beyond. "Race is my problem," a white NCO told a reporter in Frankfurt, West Germany in 1970. Not the Russians, not Vietnam. Race. And that same year, Lieutenant Colonel James S. White, the black officer who in 1969 had begun briefing Army commands worldwide on what he called the race problem, described a war which is being fought every night in barracks and other places where our soldiers gather. He, speaking at the behest of the Army's chief and secretary, insisted that the problem must be addressed. Racial tension, and the prejudices and discrimination that fed it, was not new to the U.S. Army. But in the months and years following the assassination of Martin Luther King, Jr., black enlisted men, and it was, almost without exception, men, along with some NCOs and officers, had begun to challenge the status quo. Some offered little more than rage and the violence that accompanied it. Some presented thoughtful analysis and carefully considered solutions. Most fell somewhere in the middle. But in various ways, they demanded attention to their status as black men and to the problems they faced within the U.S. Army. Their demands were often confrontational, those confrontations more explosive because many angry and unwilling draftees, men of all races, had little investment in the institution of the Army. At a time when escalating Cold War tensions and increasing instability in the Middle East were exacerbating an already dangerous and volatile strategic environment, key military leaders came to believe that the growing racial crisis threatened their ability to defend the nation. Thus, it demanded attention. If racial conflict undermined the institution's very reason for being, their logic went, the problem of race had to be addressed. Army leaders saw race as a problem because racial conflict disrupted military efficiency. There were certainly some who saw racial discrimination in the Army or the military more broadly as a moral or ethical failing. But it was the disruption that forced attention, the looming crisis that brought racial conflict to the top of the Army's list of concerns, second only to the war in Vietnam. The continuing Cold War remained a concern, but that only further emphasized the need to deal with racial conflict among U.S. troops in West Germany. That understanding that race was a problem because it disrupted the proper function of the Army shaped Army actions. And because conflict between black and white enlisted men drove the crisis, the problem was defined as black and white. Although Fort Carson's commander insisted in a communication to his troops that white soldiers, not black, were most responsible for racial conflict, it was primarily, though not always, white men doing the defining, and it was black men who were challenging the status quo. That does not mean that whites were ignored. Army programs and regulations attempted to change the behavior of white enlisted men and officers, to educate them about black history and the consequences of both individual and institutional racism. Nonetheless, there was often slippage. Many of those in positions of authority equated the problem of race, the growing racial conflict, with the demands of black soldiers. And black soldiers did demand change. They disrupted, they challenged, they sought assistance from external groups, took their cases to the press, to members of Congress, even to the president. Many concluded, quite reasonably, that only by posing problems that could not be ignored could they force the Army as an institution to address the discrimination and inequality they found in their Army service. Such tactical actions, along with explosions of rage and frustration, further solidified the institutional Army's focus. Here, race meant black. Thus, as the Army confronted its crisis of race, it did not encompass the range of racial and ethnic identities in America's Vietnam-era Army. Even though some programs acknowledged the existence of and difficulties faced by the Spanish-speaking and Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, and even Appalachians, these groups always dropped quickly from sight. In the eyes of Army leadership, members of those groups might be experiencing problems, but they were not causing problems. An Army Staff Sergeant made that point in uncomfortably direct language in a letter to the editor of Stars and Stripes. Japanese Americans are our model minority. Mexican Americans don't riot. Wounded Knee is nothing compared to Watts in Detroit. The poor mountaineer, an exhausted people in an exhausted land of exhausted hope. All have legitimate claims as minorities, he wrote. But only blacks promise retaliation against personal and institutional racism. The system's focus on black Americans, he concluded, had something to do with fear. He had a point. As it applied to the Army, however, that fear was not simply of violence. There were complaints about white commanders intimidated by black troops, afraid of explosions that might be sparked in so many ways. But Army leaders also feared the publicity drawn by racial conflict. They feared external intervention. They feared the disruptions that undermined the Army's ability to fulfill its mission of national defense. Therefore, just as Army leaders framed the problem of race as black and white, they also framed it as male. Until 1978, women belonged to a separate Women's Army Corps and, in the late 1960s, constituted even a smaller percentage, 0.8, of active duty strength than the 2% limit set by law until 1967. WACs rarely disrupted order in the U.S. Army, but even as racial conflict, including some violence, surfaced among its approximately 13,000 members, Army leaders did not see that conflict as especially significant. They were not concerned that racial conflict among WACs would disrupt the combat readiness of the Army. In response to what Army leaders defined as a critical problem, the institution focused its resources. Those Army leaders, white and black, who were charged with solving the problem, often were surprisingly creative. Yes, certainly some treated black soldiers as the problem, but many more tried to assess and address black soldiers' complaints. That meant, at times, challenging key premises and practices of the institution. Not surprisingly, they encountered roadblocks and resistance. Some resistance was blatantly racist. Some was generational, older black NCOs and officers often included. Some individuals were sympathetic but had other priorities. Some found the proposed solutions antithetical to the Army's fundamental principles of discipline, order, hierarchical authority, and uniformed service. This book explores the Army's attempts to solve the problem of race in the context of those fundamental principles and in the broader context of what I shorthand as institutional logic, the collective force of the Army's culture, history and tradition, its structure and organization, its avowed mission and purpose, its policies and practices. I argue that the U.S. Army's institutional logic, shaped the ways in which its leaders and members defined the problem at hand. It made certain proposed solutions more likely than others. It determined, to a great extent, how those attempted solutions played out, what would most easily succeed, what would more likely fail. More broadly, I am arguing that if we want to understand the process of social change in the modern United States, we have to look beyond the movements for social change. Change, most certainly, originates in the struggles and protests and demands of the oppressed and their allies. But such demands are rarely the endpoint, and few activists see them as such. To make a fundamental difference, change has to be enacted into law or translated into policy, and with sufficient mechanisms of enforcement to make the change significant. Change has to percolate through culture, and most fundamentally, change has to be managed through the institutions of American life, including its workplaces, its economic institutions and its purveyors of law and order, its schools and universities, its media, and in this case, the U.S. Army, a massive and highly visible institution that touched the lives of tens of millions of Americans in the latter half of the 20th century. Military experience shaped how millions of young Americans during this era came to understand racial conflict and the struggle for racial justice in the United States. 9.1 million served on active duty in the U.S. military over the course of the U.S. war in Vietnam. During this era, the U.S. Army, sometimes within Department of Defense initiatives, focused directly on the problem of race. And because the U.S. Army had an almost unlimited control over individual action, in the words of a highly critical study from the Congressional Black Caucus, that focus forced soldiers' attention. In its attempts to solve the problem of race, the U.S. Army could bring to bear tools that were unavailable to civilian institutions. Unlike civilian workplaces, schools, and universities, or most other institutions of American life, the Army is a hierarchical institution with far-reaching authority over its members. That authority gave it, again in the words of the Congressional Black Caucus, a unique chance to begin the work of eliminating discrimination and racism. As the Army confronted the growing problem of race, it relied on the tools of hierarchy and authority. But it went further. In surprisingly wide-ranging efforts, the U.S. Army pushed the boundaries of its institutional logic and challenged some of its fundamental principles. The Army's struggles over racial policy and practice were rarely simple, and they were never simply two-sided. Here the challenges were great. Large numbers of young men, black and white, many of them unwilling draftees in a failing war, forced together day and night as currents of racial division and anger tore the nation apart, and the stakes were high, the ability of the U.S. Army to defend the nation. External pressure was also intense, as organizations including the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and the Congressional Black Caucus saw the military as an efficient use of their resources. Success in the military sphere, they knew, could have immediate and profound effects. As Representative Ron Dellums, co-chair of the Congressional Black Caucus's hearings on racism in the military, noted, some who sought change were now focused on changing fundamental institutions in this country so that they relate to human pride and human dignity. As powerful as the military is, he insisted, it will change. And it did. With both commitment and resistance, and always with mission held paramount, the U.S. Army changed. As an institution, the Army rejected claims of color blindness, insisting that, I see only one color and that's olive drab, even when sincerely embraced, was no better than a cop-out. It questioned the sanctity of the chain of command, tried new methods of leadership, altered the criteria for officer evaluation. It created new approaches to training and education, some of them definitely best left in the 1970s, and offered knowledge of soldiers' different histories and cultures as a means to understanding. It recognized that Army regulations defaulted white and changed them. It experimented with allowing its members to claim identities that went beyond soldier and to display symbols that expressed those identities. It confronted off-post discrimination. It reformed portions of its system of military justice, and it implemented programs of affirmative action seeking to make the Army's officer corps resemble the makeup of the nation, even if it fell short of the racial balance of the enlisted ranks. None of these changes was sufficient if the goal was to solve the problem of race. As repeated testimony makes clear, much work remains to be done. But they did vastly improve the conditions of people of color in the U.S. Army, and the reforms did accomplish their goal. They stabilized the institution. In the end, this is a story replete with missteps and bad faith, but it is also a story of commitment, innovation, and success. 1. A tactic of silence. On a humid afternoon in mid-October 1968, Major Lavelle Merritt, described by one newspaper as a uniformed Negro, strode into the official press briefing in Saigon and passed out copies of a statement asserting that the American military services are the strongest citadels of racism on the face of the earth. Merritt had no official business in that room. His right to distribute such a statement was unclear and vigorously contested. By 1968, the military was struggling over the legal limits of dissent by those in uniform. Merritt knew he was on tricky legal ground. He knew his actions were likely to have consequences. But this infantry officer, nearing the forced retirement that would mark the end of his Army career, had concluded that he had nothing to lose and much to gain. To his mind, it was his manhood that was at stake. The next day, on the other side of the international date line, Merritt's claims made the front page of the Chicago Tribune, with its banner slogan, "The American Paper for Americans." The Honolulu Star-Bulletin headlined its story, "Negro Major Finds Army Racism Strong." The Los Angeles Times offered, "Negro Major Charges U.S. Army is Racist." Similar claims appeared from Elmira, New York to Hobbs, New Mexico, in America's small towns and big cities alike. With few exceptions, each paper ran a photo of Major Merritt, a fit-looking man of 40 with close-cropped hair and the sort of heavy black-framed glasses that would not become fashionable for decades. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch captioned his photo, "Major Lavelle Merritt calls Army a racist organization." Most powerful was coverage in the New York Times, where Merritt's complaints, Army denounced by Negro Major, equality and justice denied to blacks, he asserts, seemed simply confirmation of the heart-wrenching story Times editors placed adjacent to it. The parents of a 21-year-old soldier, here shown receiving their son's posthumously awarded Bronze Star, had learned he was missing in action the same day they heard from the wife of another son, a soldier stationed in Germany, that the couple had been unable to rent an apartment there because of their race. And that afternoon, the grieving mother told reporters, still heavy with the cruelty of discrimination, the Army notified us that Fred was missing in action in Vietnam. Major Merritt, scant column inches away, offered the broader lesson. The American people have for years been told that the military leads the nation in breaking down and eliminating all vestiges of segregation and discriminatory treatment of minority groups, he said. This is a blatant lie. None of this was good news for the Army, which had gotten a fair amount of mileage from the relative calm of its integrated forces as violence erupted in the civilian world, whether in the form of murderous attacks on those who sought their full rights or of cities in flames during the long hot summers of the mid-1960s. When Frederick Ellis Davison was promoted to brigadier general in September 1968, becoming only the third black man to reach flag rank in the history of not only the Army, but the entire U.S. military, he praised the Army's unbelievable progress in race relations. That was the story the Army meant to tell, and one that many of its officers and NCOs, white and black, endorsed. Not perfection, but progress. From that perspective, it had been only 20 years since President Harry Truman ended official racial segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces, and even fewer since segregation had ended in fact. How could one not applaud what had been accomplished, not recognize the positive changes the Army was making? Certainly, those who embraced the story of progress would concede there were problems. A scarcity of black faces in positions of leadership and command, true. But they could not pull generals out of nowhere. There was no possibility of lateral hires, no fast track from second lieutenant to brigadier general. The Army was starting to grow a cohort of black leaders, to move past the poor decisions of the past. That would take time, the story went, but it would happen. And off-post housing, that was a perpetual issue, most particularly in the American South and in Germany. President John F. Kennedy's Committee on Equal Opportunity in the Armed Forces had highlighted the problem back in 1961. But surrounding communities were not under military control, and relationships were especially tricky in host nations. Those who saw progress acknowledged that civilian discrimination was a problem. They nonetheless emphasized the changes accomplished and to come. What of the indignities of boy, the outrage of nigger, the casual racism in the daily life of the enlisted man? Many whites never registered that language, or they paid it no heed. They had come of age where such words were common, or they saw them as no different than Pollock and Wop and Kike in a sergeant's vocabulary of abuse. Countering such lapses were tales of the notable camaraderie between the races at Fort Bragg, the insistence from Vietnam that we don't talk or think race out here, we depend on each other too much. I see only one color, and that's olive drab. Such interpretations seem undeniably self-serving, especially in retrospect. They were, however, in keeping with both external and internal analysis. Sociologist Charles Moskos, who had spent a year studying the issue, concluded in 1966 that, in the words of the Washington Post, the Army was an example of integration success. Time magazine told its close to 20 million readers in late 1966 that despite a few blemishes, the armed forces remain the model of the reasonably integrated society that the U.S. looks forward to in a new generation. Black leaders agreed, praising the military for its progress, endorsing it as a model for the nation. And where it may have mattered most, inside the Army, race did not make the list of command concerns. When the Secretary of Defense received a top-secret briefing on Vietnam soldiers' morale in July 1967, he heard about the use of marijuana and narcotics, rising court-martial rates, and the extent of the black market, but not a word about race. Just 2 years later, by late summer of 1969, both the Army chief and its secretary would put race second only to the war itself in their catalog of concerns. In this shift, as in so much else for the Army and for the nation, 1968 marked a turning point. In civilian society, by 1968, racial conflict was both pervasive and explosive. The quest for equal rights, for full integration into a colorblind society, the model for which the only one color, and that's olive drab Army, got so much praise, persisted. But it was increasingly challenged by those who embraced black power and black pride, who rejected patience and slow progress, who, in the wake of violence that reached back to the holds of slave ships and forward to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., were willing to seek freedom by any means necessary. The Army did not, could not, stand fully apart from the society it served. It had become increasingly impossible by this point in the war to construct and enforce boundaries between world's military and civilian. For the war in Vietnam demanded men. U.S. Army strength almost doubled between 1961 and 1968, increasing by more than 700,000 uniformed personnel. Not all those troops were in Vietnam. Over 100 nations had some, often quite small, U.S. military presence in 1968, with 25 hosting at least 1,000 uniformed Americans. Most of the military forces not in the United States and its territories, 1.9 million, or Vietnam, 537,000, were stationed in West Germany, 214,000, the Republic of Korea, 62,000, and Japan Okinawa, 83,000. But the wartime demand for men changed the shape and, to some extent, the character of the Army. It was young men, raised in the turmoil of 1960s revolt, who would swell the Army's ranks over the course of this increasingly unpopular war. Whether draftees or volunteers, many of whom were draft-motivated, the great majority of these men did not plan an Army career. Their long-term allegiance was not to the institution and its culture and practices. Their ties to home and the weight of their civilian identities were less fully eclipsed in the 2 draftees or 3 volunteer years the military required of them than had been the case with men who had joined before the war, and the practice of rotating individuals rather than units through year-long tours in Vietnam left men bound less tightly to their brothers in arms. Perhaps the Army's racial problems did come from without, as Army leaders would repeatedly insist. It is not likely that the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?